Thank you all very much. Well, we've heard the Deputy Prime Minister on resilience. We're now going to get into some really crunchy strategic deterrence stuff, which is really about the challenges of the coming years and decades in terms of deterrence, 21st century deterrence, and what we as Western nations might do to meet that challenge. And we've got a fantastic panel. Frank Miller, who was a senior Department of Defense and White House official dealing with all sorts of matters of nuclear strategy. David Omand, senior MOD, ran GCHQ for a while, also professor at this fine school. Then we've got Marina Henke from the Hertie School in Berlin, which I'm told is analogous to Blavatnik and the Kennedy School in the US. So in other words, about policy and government. And lastly, we've got Kristin van Bruusgaard from Norway, who runs the intelligence school there, and clearly, given Norway's location, has a particular focus on Russia and the High North. So it's a fantastic panel. And I'm going to start off by asking Frank to just give us a bit of an overview of the 21st century deterrent challenges from his perspective.
Thank you very much. And great to be here. And a bit of truth in lending at the beginning. I am a practitioner, not a scholar, in this fine institution. I think the conference has done a very good job of setting up the kind of world that we have now inherited, and it's a very dangerous world. Not to overdo the metaphor, but there is a whiff of the 1930s. I mean, in Vladimir Putin, you have a messianic zealot, a revanchist, someone who seeks Russophone incorporation at a minimum. The USSR rebuilt more than that. Someone rebuilding his nuclear forces since the mid-2010s and who's broken, by my count, 10 arms control agreements that he either inherited or signed. Other side of the world, Xi Jinping, also messianic, revanchist, trying to bring back a new China after 100 years of shame, expansionist, coveting his neighbor's resources, claiming the South China Sea, in charge of a massive military buildup, including nuclear weapons, and both believe the West will not respond. It's too weak to respond. And the view is growing in Washington, based in part on a major congressional panel that I and 11 others were on last year, that the United States needs to have a deterrent which is capable of deterring Russia and China simultaneously. And why is that? Because we have to worry about the real possibility of simultaneous aggression. And that aggression could be planned or it could be opportunistic, but it needs to be we need to be capable of deterring both. It doesn't change the fundamentals of deterrence, but it creates new challenges. In each case, I want to emphasize that conventional deterrence is important because you don't want to raise the war to a nuclear level. But the nuclear forces are essential in backing up the conventional forces. And for conventional deterrence, it's not that hard a job as has been described. There are two very different contexts. In Europe, it's NATO and US ground forces. In the Pacific, it's US Navy and Air Forces with Japan, Australia, and others. And given the US role that would have to be played by the Navy in the Pacific, the Royal Navy and Allied navies here will have to play a great deal of the role in the Atlantic and in the far north. For nuclear deterrence to work, however, both we and the United Kingdom must continue to climb out of the hole we dug ourselves in over the past several decades. We allowed our deterrents to age to the point that they are brittle. They need to be replaced quickly. With the UK, that's the Dreadnought program and the replacement warhead. With the United States, it's the entire strategic triad, bombers, land-based missiles, and strategic submarines, as well as making more robust our capability to deter Chinese or Russian intimidation or aggression with theater-based nuclear forces, of which they have a lot and we don't have enough. But the real job is to get inside the heads of the two people who could initiate aggression even up to the nuclear level, and that is to get inside Putin's head and inside Xi's head to say, we have credible nuclear forces, we have credible conventional forces. A world in which you start aggression will end up being worse than the world you have now, so don't. And the last thing I think I would say is that more than ever, publics and politicians need to be engaged. We've lost that over the past several decades. We used to know during the Cold War who the enemy was. We don't anymore. And if this is all going to work, publics need to understand that.
Well, that's a theme I think I'll pick up with Marina shortly. But Kristin, if I could ask you first. I mean, of course, we always remember back in Cold War days that Norway is one of those NATO members that borders Russia. How central is that focus for you? And do you really feel a sense of nuclear danger as well as conventional risk in Norway?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think that the answer to the question is yes. I think that pertains not only to Norway but to the entirety of NATO as an alliance. The war in Ukraine has evidently demonstrated the saliency of nuclear weapons in Russian military strategy. And we've spent a lot of time in the Western security policy community deliberating the issue of potential Russian nuclear employment in the context of the Ukraine war. But I think that we should not necessarily overestimate the lessons that we can draw about Russian nuclear behavior from the Ukraine crisis, because I think that the nuclear challenge that Russia comprises to NATO is something different and even broader than what we've seen in the context of the Ukraine crisis, where the role of nuclear weapons in a potential direct confrontation between Russia and NATO would be quite different, and I think even more present than it has been in the Ukraine war, even if that to us seems almost sort of difficult to fathom at the moment. I think a potential direct confrontation between NATO and Russia would comprise a much larger nuclear shadow. And it is precisely that type of confrontation that Russia has designed its nuclear strategy around and for in the entirety of the period after the Cold War. So I think that Western countries need to evidently pay a lot of attention to the crisis, the ongoing war and the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, the escalatory potential there. But we also need to pay sufficient attention to the potential challenge it is that a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia would entail even greater risks of nuclear employment. That has repercussions for the way we formulate deterrence policy. It also has repercussions for the way we formulate our defense plans, preparedness plans, etc. And this is a new challenge, I think, in as compared to the rest of the post-Cold War era, where we as societies have become accustomed to not necessarily paying that much attention to this particular challenge.
And with a Russian leader who's apparently much less risk-averse than the Soviet leadership was. Marina, both Kristin and Frank have alluded to public attitudes. I mean, thinking back to the sort of high days of the theatre nuclear forces modernization with Pershing and Cruz and the huge demos in Germany, and there was a huge public awareness of it at that time, wasn't there? I mean, where do you see the public now on this? How far behind the curve potentially are they in terms of understanding of what's at stake?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that the Ukraine war, and I concur with you, but still it is a war that is fought in the shadow of nuclear power. The restraint that we see on the side of the Western powers, of the United States, of NATO, is because Russia has nuclear weapons. I think if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, this war would look very, very different. Because from the get-go, Biden made it clear he doesn't want to escalate it to the nuclear level. Now, this was not a war that really threatened the existence of the United States. So he was not willing to take it to the nuclear level and also threaten what Neil Ferguson said in an earlier panel, actually, the use of U.S. nuclear forces. And I remember in December, or November, December of 2021, I was taking part in workshops with the incoming German government. That is a coalition government of the Social Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, and the Green Party. And we were working very hard that they wouldn't actually leave the nuclear sharing agreement with the United States under NATO. This was the attitude of Germany just before Russia's invasion. And the vast majority of Germans were opposing nuclear weapons. and were even, like they wanted that Germany would actually join the Nuclear Abolition Treaty. So there was a conviction that nuclear weapons no longer matter. They couldn't even understand why the United States or why the UK and France were holding on to these nuclear weapons, and Germany should abandon all kind of nuclear agreements. That has changed by now in Germany. Especially in the first couple weeks of the war, we had all the major German newspapers talking about the nuclear threat. But what I think the difference is among the German population compared to the British population, and this goes directly to your question, is that they're not entirely sure how to deal with it. Right? Putin is blackmailing the West and also the Ukrainians, right? He uses the rhetoric of threatening, especially a tactical nuclear weapon. This is a psychological move. He wants to intimidate. And his target, on the one hand, are elites, but on the other hand, are also populations. And our goal has to be that the European population and also the German population cannot be intimidated. And how can this be done? By educating them. Right? And we're very far from that, because right now, I think if there was really a tactical nuclear strike, you would have hundreds and thousands of Germans going on the street in Berlin, in Cologne, in Munich, in Stuttgart, and basically being intimidated and saying, let's stop. And Germany can no longer support the Ukrainians. This is getting too dangerous. And this is exactly what Putin wants. Right? This is intimidation working, blackmail working. And so it's a huge burden on us to tell the public, you should not be intimidated, right? We can deal with that. And you should not take these threats seriously, and even if Putin would use a tactical nuclear weapon, we can survive it.
Extraordinary vision there of the possible demos that would follow actual nuclear use. David Omand, I mean, you were at a senior level in the MOD in those last days of the Cold War, and presumably the kind of deterrent calculus then, Michael Quinlan and the Moscow Criterion and all that stuff, was relatively straightforward. Could I ask you to pick up now on Frank's point about China as well? We've obviously heard a good deal about Russia, but also maybe looking further out, North Korea, Iran, the possibility of an Israeli-Iranian exchange. I mean, it begins to become hugely complex, doesn't it, as a calculation?
The important thing to remember is that deterrence is neither an absolute nor an abstract condition. It depends on time and place, circumstances, and the personality of the people or persons you're trying to deter. So you have to ask the question, and there are different questions we could ask, but the one that's, who are we trying to deter from doing what over what time period? Alter the parameters of that question, you'll get different answers. So for me, at the moment, I think it's vital, literally vital, that President Putin continues to believe that an armed attack on a member state of NATO, even a limited incursion or bombing, would set in train a chain of events that he would not be able to control, and that would not only leave him worse off, but would leave the Russia that he cares about very much worse off. Now, we can't take for granted that he will continue to believe that. So the approach that I recommend is we avoid doing things which would undermine that belief, and we try and do things which would reinforce it. He will no doubt be looking forward to the potential election of Donald Trump. We, from the UK side, our challenge is to deliver what we know as now as the nuclear enterprise that Frank referred to, new submarines, new warhead, new infrastructure, ensuring that our deterrent can continue robustly into the foreseeable future. Frank is right, I think, to bring in China, and you mentioned this, Mark. It is, in present circumstances, where the two countries swear loyalty, fealty to each other, I note that Russia is probably the demandeur, and China's position is probably stronger as a result of the war in Ukraine. But nonetheless, you cannot rule out future circumstances in which they would act together to support some act of aggression that involves NATO and therefore involves us directly here in the UK. I think it's worth a final thought, Mark. When a leader has to take a difficult decision in crisis circumstances, to get a wise decision, you have to fuse together two very different kinds of thinking. One comes from the limbic system, it's emotionally driven, this is what I want, this is the way the world must be. And the other part is the analytical part that says, well, these are the practical options that are open, and this is the limits of what you can actually hope to get away with. What I perceive at the moment is a little too much of the former, emboldened by his attack on Ukraine, and not enough of the latter. So in our discourse, in our public discourse, that's where we have to, forgetting about Cold War analysis, just get over the very simple point that an attack on NATO territory, an armed attack on NATO territory, would be potentially catastrophic, and he has to believe that. Now, final thought, none of what I've said means that we can, and certainly we are not, deterring Russia from attacking NATO here and now, below the threshold of an armed attack. All over Europe, we have sabotage, we have disruption, attempts to disrupt the flow of weaponry through to Ukraine. So that battle is going on, but let's keep it below the threshold of armed attack.
Let's dive into one or two more of these challenges then, and then we'll move on to remedies. You've set out some sort of philosophical remedies there, David, in terms of attitude we should take to this. Frank, just listening to what Kristin was saying about the sort of change in Russian mentality and doctrine, you know, we see this written up that the Russians have had strategic war games rehearsing the so-called escalate to de-escalate, that they think they could drop a nuclear weapon on a NATO country and somehow then everyone would be so shocked. And, well, based on what you're saying, Marina, that might be the case in terms of public opinion. How does NATO develop its own doctrine to sort of adjust to this apparent new reality of Russia's adoption of this more, well, lowering the nuclear threshold, I guess, is the term?
So I would put a cautionary note down. I mean, doctrine is doctrine. That's what troops are trained to do. There's one decision maker, and that's Vladimir Putin. And I don't think doctrine matters to him. I think he was, as my fellow panelists have said, he will do what he thinks he can get away with. And therefore, what NATO needs to do, and NATO is revitalizing its own theater-based deterrent with new aircraft and a new modern weapon. And the United Kingdom, the United States are modernizing our strategic deterrent. Deterrence at the end of the day is the product of capability and will. We're building the capability. We need to convince Putin that if he does attack a NATO state, that we have the will to respond, and therefore to deter any attack in the first place. And I think the same thing applies in the Pacific, really, as far as Xi Jinping is concerned. It's vital that they understand that there will be a response.
Kristin.
Yeah, if I may comment on that, my understanding is that earlier Sir Lawrence Friedman was commenting that it's quite important what words we use when we describe the challenge that we are facing and when we describe the actions that have been taken. And I think it's quite important that we continue to communicate that NATO and the West are upholding an effective deterrence vis-a-vis Russia as we speak. I don't think we should underestimate the efficacy of our own deterrence, which comprises evidently military capabilities that include both nuclear and conventional capabilities, and conventional capabilities are quite important in that Russian reading of our ability to inflict damage on Russia. And then evidently it comprises also other capabilities and components, including our societal resilience. And I think that we, in the Western security policy discourse at times, tend to sort of over or underestimate our own ability to deter Russia. I think that the Ukraine war has also demonstrated that the Russian leadership also remains concerned about the prospect of a direct confrontation between Russia and Western powers. And that it has also reinforced this, well, what we always knew to be the case, that nuclear weapons are essentially political weapons, and that the decision to potentially use nuclear weapons is a political decision that we at times tend to sort of underemphasize when we almost describe it as an automatic process by which, you know, conventional defeat on the battlefield will lead to nuclear weapons employment in Ukraine. I don't think that's not the way it will evolve. At the end of the day, this will be a decision taken by Putin and his close cronies. And as far as I can tell from the empirics thus far, also that Russian political leadership and military leadership is appreciating the political nature of nuclear weapons and the significant, the extremely dangerous consequences nuclear weapons employment would have for Russia and for the Russian leadership and regime.
Sorry, David first, and then Marina. Yeah.
That puts it very well. There's an additional consideration I want to inject, which is to get it over not only to President Putin but to his generals, that any thought you could have an extremely limited, say, air attacks on Poland to disrupt the supply of weapons, or an incursion into Estonia, or wherever, and expect that to be confined militarily to that space is wrong. And that particularly Sakyo, and he would command forces to attack Russian targets in that circumstance wherever they could be found. And some of those would be in Russia, some of them might well be in the Far East. I don't expect the naval commands would stand aside in the event of armed aggression against NATO. It would be impossible to calculate where all that would end up. And that's the danger that Putin has to recognize. It's what I call lateral escalation, rather than just the vertical escalation up the ladder.
Marina, yeah.
If we have learned something, then it's also that Putin is a master of the gray zone, right? And I think this is where actually the difficulty lies. Because maybe there is a nuclear explosion, but Putin blames it on the Ukrainians, right? There were several instances and talk around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, for example, where one, could have made such a narrative. And I think this is where NATO doesn't really have a good response, right? That it is a nuclear event, but how do we respond? Do we categorize it as a full-blown attack? Or, since there are these question marks, and again, going back to the public, it's very important because, we're all democracies and our public has to accept the decisions we are taking. And if the narrative is not clear-cut, and Putin might be so smart and create a narrative that is not clear-cut, I think we are in real trouble. And secondly, I think in this entire nuclear scenario, the European pillar in NATO needs to be much stronger, because the truth is right now, Putin fears American nuclear weapons. In all honesty, he doesn't really fear UK nuclear weapons and French nuclear weapons.
I don't think that's true.
Well, I think
There's
that's
quite a
true.
lot of evidence.
You look at discussions, whether this is in military thought or general discussions of Russian generals, British and French nuclear weapons, barely don't show up. But it doesn't mean, it has to stay that way. But I think a discussion needs to start. What is Europe's role in deterring Russia and also China, and what's America's role? And I think this discussion needs to be honest, it needs to be serious, and it cannot just all be on the United States, whether Trump will get elected or not. I think Europe in NATO needs to get together. It's not just on Great Britain, but since France has such a strange position on its nuclear deterrent and doesn't really want to work in a NATO context, I think it's up to the Brits to lead.
Can I pick up on your phrase, David, lateral escalation? That's clearly something Russia can do as well. in a situation where, for example, Russia goes for subsea infrastructure in international waters, space-based systems.
Yeah.
How does that play into, what is the Western calculus there? Because this is not an attack on the territory of a member state of NATO.
So I think the first thing is that the nuclear, I'm sorry, did I preempt you?
No, go ahead.
It's important to recognize the nuclear deterrent is not an all-purpose deterrent. And so we have to have conventional forces. We have to have strong cyber forces, special operations forces. We have to have, space has turned into an area of warfare, despite what the Russians are trying to contend. So we have to have a series of deterrent capabilities, of which nuclear is the top end of the rung. And so in all of those areas, if the Russian submarine goes out in a time of crisis to go near some of the cables, well, somebody's going to have to be looking and watching within firing range, things like that. And I would say, I'm sorry, I really do believe the Russians have an influence campaign to convince people they don't worry about the British deterrent, but they do. They really do.
But they very rarely talk about them.
Well, there's a reason for that.
But you know, the big question is, so the UK has a very limited nuclear force, obviously. And so if there is one of these gray zones attack, or a tactical nuclear weapon, would Great Britain really respond with a strategic nuclear weapon? I don't think so. And this is the problem of it. It's the
But I don't think it would ever have been a strategic response
oddly,
to that form of
so we were
gray zone
talking about a
attack.
situation in high Cold War times where the US might have had 30 or 40 ballistic missile submarines and the UK and France 4 each. Well, now the US has 14 and we still have 4 each. So in relative terms, the UK-French firepower, call it what you will, is greater. But maybe just picking up on Marina's last point, David, is there an argument for a reintroduction of a sub-strategic British nuclear weapon? This was the capability phased out in the 90s, the air-dropped weapon.
Yes, and with hindsight, it would have been great if we'd cooperated with the French and ASMP, but it was phenomenally expensive. And there were other priorities at the end of the Cold War, so we didn't.
Do we reintroduce that capability for the UK?
You've got to really think through the logic of why that would be a sensible expenditure as against the conventional force expenditure and completing our existing nuclear modernization program. But we're already in a position today where GPS in the Baltic is being disrupted by the Russians. What are we doing about it? What protests are we making? And my mind goes back to 2014 and Ukraine. What did we all do about that? And the answer was not enough.
Could I say?
Sorry, Kristin just wanted to come in, I think.
Yeah, no, well, I would just comment quickly on that with regard to our responsive or potentially escalatory options in response to whatever capability the Russians or other actors for that matter could employ. Again, I think I would argue that NATO as an alliance, but also Western countries writ large, have come quite far as compared to 3, 5, 8 years ago when it comes to, first of all, recognizing, appreciating these types of threats, and second of all, formulating actual and sort of credible policy responses to such threats. So I wouldn't necessarily sort of underestimate the types of capabilities that we could put to use in response to these types of actions. Then evidently we can point to a number of examples and say, oh, in this instance we should have done more, we should have been more proactive. But at least at a very minimum, I would posit that this conversation is taking place in a much more active way these days than it has for some time. And secondly, on the European deterrent, I think first of all there is a key element relating to the sort of a division of labor between the conventional and the nuclear element here, and Frank was pointing to some of this, which I think plays very directly into this discussion on a division of labor between European and US allies in terms of how we reinforce and build an even stronger and more credible deterrent. I do think there is a role for a European nuclear deterrent. I don't necessarily agree that the Russians are not at all preoccupied with that European nuclear deterrent. I think they are, and they do make that also explicit on a number of occasions, including in arms control contexts, where they tend to point precisely to the fact that there are these three independent decision-making centers when it comes to nuclear deterrence in
Sorry, quick point of clarification. When you talk about a European deterrent, do you mean essentially the UK and French elements being part of a targeting plan or command authority, or do you mean an actual European developed nuclear capability?
No, I mean, I'm just talking about the European countries who are currently armed with nuclear weapons.
Okay, so I'm going to pitch in one last question and then we'll open it up. Sorry, Frank, yeah.
The UK does have a sub-strategic capability. When the W177 was retired, if you go back and look in the defense white papers, the UK announced that it had a low-yield warhead on a Trident missile.
Yeah.
To take the place of sub-strategic. The United States in 2019 followed the British example, finally, to do the same kind of thing for a sub-strategic role. So there is a UK sub-strategic capability that's out there.
Lastly, I just want to ask you, we've talked about doctrine, we've talked about threat a bit. The kind of procurement holiday that accompanied the end of the Cold War was a really quite prolonged and intense one with regard to the industry that makes nuclear weapons. And when you read about, the age of the facilities at Oak Ridge or Los Alamos and things like that, I mean, can the US actually do it? Can they, over the next 5 to 10 years, modernize their nuclear arsenal in the nuclear weapons sense? And what kind of scale of investment is required?
It's going to be a major scale of investment. We can't do it completely in 5 years. We could do it in 10 years if the administrations put money against it. But it's really two things. It's facilities that need to be knocked down and rebuilt, but it's workforce. And we're in this terrible position because of the holiday of which you speak, and the UK has the same problem, where the workforce has gone down and the same set of critical skills, welders on high strength steel, electricians who are qualified to work on nuclear facilities, people who are qualified to do steel and rebar and concrete work on nuclear facilities are being claimed by the weapons designers for the atomic weapons, for the people who build submarines, and for other things. So it's a workforce issue, and it's dramatic, and both governments are trying to bring that workforce to higher levels, but that is your limiting factor.
We're still suffering from the hangover of the very short-sighted decision in the Cameron era to delay the ordering of the boats. And that meant we had to refuel as well as refit HMS Vanguard. Extraordinarily difficult and lengthy process.
7-year refit.
Yeah, we really stretched the existing fleet, and of course then suddenly having to start up with the new boats when the order was finally placed. We've got manpower shortages, skill shortages, and this applies to the infrastructure, the nuclear infrastructure. It applies to AWE and the design and construction of the new warhead, and it applies to the submarines and to Rolls-Royce and the reactor. So we can do it. I'm reasonably confident, but a number of things have to go our way. And when two things. One is maintenance of the aim. We mustn't have any more changes of direction. You've just got to get absolutely focused on delivering the nuclear enterprise. And the other thing is that we've got to fund it. And that takes us beyond the horizon of any defence review of the current government or any future government. We've got to have that continuity of funding to make sure we deliver it.
Excellent. Right. Well, you caught my eye first, so I don't know if we've... Yes, a microphone is on its way to you.
Caroline Flynn MacLeod. David, hi. I'd like to take up this public opinion issue because we were very adept in the early 1980s at influencing public opinion. And I was part of that campaign, and indeed government helped to fund through an NGO. We had a minister who coordinated all the groups that were beginning to take on the CND, who were doing precisely what Maria is talking about. And we were very robust in arguing what deterrence was all about, why we needed NATO, why we needed to defend ourselves. And I think government has been very lax over the years in explaining the need for for NATO and the transatlantic element of that. And people who are involved in that campaign, I can name but not here, a number of people very senior in government and the media who were part of that involvement in government. And the minister in the MOD, I don't know whether you recall the minister, David, Winston Churchill, the late Winston Churchill, and it was all about the robustness of our leaders.
Is this a question to Marina? Do you want to?
Well, it's just a comment of the need that, and I think.
Well, let's have a question.
Do we need a proper public information campaign that governments need to put money into?
Okay, that's a good
One-word
question.
answer, yes.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
it should come from the next government,
And it's
whatever that government is.
and there are best practices. You know, I'm spending my time right now in German archives because also, I mean, in Germany it was maybe a little bit less successful because to a certain degree Helmut Schmidt had to leave, but then Kohl maintained the same policy, right, which is interesting. Yeah. But in the big picture of things, the knowledge was there, the type of communication that was successful is there, and we have to restart. But in Germany, I think here in the UK it's a little bit better, but we're really starting from zero.
There's a gentleman there, and then we'll go deeper into the.
Thank you. In the conference so far, there's been not much discussion about the role of Poland, which is spending more money in GDP per capita than anybody else and got a very large economy. And we talked about NATO as a whole, but could you see a scenario in which, say, Russia attacked either the Latvia or the Baltics, that Poland itself would just take a unilateral action and say, revenge, and now is our time, and actually take them out? Because that's the sort of scenario I can see. They're pretty tough, and they're sort of itching to have a go. But we're about NATO as a whole, but what about the individual members of NATO acting unilaterally?
Well, NATO operates by consensus. One of the things that in July at the NATO summit, the ministers really leaders should pay attention to is the sense of solidarity within NATO, and not every member state of NATO necessarily thinks the same way about all of this. So that's some business they have to do.
Yeah, what do you feel about solidarity? I mean, those countries that won't get near 2%, let alone 2.5%, do you wonder whether some of those countries, were Norway to be a victim of aggression, would rally to your defence?
Well, I think evidently it's always an ongoing discussion related to NATO solidarity and, for example, actions that could potentially be interpreted differently by different allied countries. But I think the issue that you point out is sort of also an example of the solidity of collective security, because that collective security does not necessarily only rely on Article 5 and the ability of NATO to stand united. It also comprises individual allied states and close collaboration between a number of individual and sort of bi- and multilateral allied states. We had mentioned the Joint Expeditionary Force earlier today, the JEF, which is a close collaboration between Nordic countries, the UK, and a couple of other countries. So there are, I think that the collective security guarantee comprises not only Article 5, but also a number of other collaborative efforts, which means that an adversary would not necessarily be able to conclude decisively, if I conduct this act of aggression, I will face no consequences whatsoever. And I think that unpredictability is quite important.
Robert Fox at the back there.
Oh, is it me? Okay. Oh. Thank you. Hi, my name is Isabella. I'm a student at the University of Texas in Austin. And I was just wondering, I'm studying international relation and space law, and so in regards to the Outer Space Treaty of 1966, it says that no nuclear weapons will be allowed to be in space, but obviously the world has changed a lot since 1966. So I was wondering if nations will uphold this treaty, or if more space law will be created to hold nations accountable to not have satellites destroyed that affect a lot of civilians around the world.
Yeah, Frank, I guess you've got to.
Well, first, I'm only speaking from press reports, okay? Second, if Putin went ahead, the mere thought that the Russian government, from press reports, is contemplating putting nuclear weapons in space means that's the 10th arms control treaty that Putin would destroy. It's a terribly diabolical thing. It would really destroy large segments of Western and even Chinese economic systems, cause a huge drop in our capabilities without killing any people. But the key question, I think this is a key question for governments, based on press reports, is how do you deter him from deploying those, putting them in space? If they're in space, how do you deter him from using them? And that's probably one of the hardest and newest questions that our governments have to face collectively. It's a major conundrum.
The problem with international law is that who enforces it, right? There is no international court. So it's all about deterrence, either deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment. But there is no court, there is no entity that immediately, if Russia does what it does, that there's a punishment. And this is why it's very, very problematic. Right? So it's then up to the international community to send a message that is so forceful and that is so clear that, you know, if you actually do something in space, this will happen. That, you know, like they might be deterred, but this doesn't really, I don't see very concrete steps being implemented right now, you know, in the sense.
Robert, we'll get to you now.
Sorry, can you hear me? Robert Fox. But it fits exactly with your question. The expression of lateral proliferation, and all five of you have alluded to this. Putin's expansion into a truly global maritime strategy, which is on the way. If you look at the last big speeches, almost all of them have mentioned the Arctic. China, Russia are now working with Argentina to go into the Antarctic. Militarization in breach of the Antarctic Treaty. Particularly taking David Omand's point, how do you address this complexity in deterrence politics, in deterrence doctrine, and in deterrence practice? The sea, a global strategy, and beneath the sea.
The comes back to my question of who are you trying to deter from doing what? And exploiting the northern rim of Russian territory is something that the Russians would expect to be able to do. They will derive economic benefit from it. Changing climatic conditions mean that they will be able to benefit from additional mineral extraction. Do we have a presence up there? Do our Canadian allies have a presence up there? There are things that NATO could begin to plan to do. But you can't deter Russia from doing things which are within Russian competence. Again, if they start to build facilities that are a direct risk to us, then I think we again have to be able to stand up to the Russians. And on space, we're not entirely powerless. There are threats which we can pose to Russia, which, like where Russia would, particularly President Putin, would have to take into account that there are other weapon systems, that they too are dependent on space systems for that military command and control. Those too could be placed at risk. Now, we're not today necessarily in a position to do that, but if we were really determined to have a conversation, tough conversation, saying don't take that step and we will stop thinking about taking our steps, then you might get back to respect for the reasons why the Outer Space Treaty was signed, which was to prevent mayhem in space.
Sorry, Kristin.
Yeah, let me just completely concur with Sir David in terms of the need to be relatively specific when we formulate our deterrence policies and precise in terms of defining what concrete actions we are seeking to deter. I think in our debates on deterrence policy, there is the risk of stretching the concept to such an extent that it becomes almost an impossible task if we are talking about trying to deter basically all types of sub-threshold activities. It becomes quite difficult to draw the line between what we comprise sub-threshold activities or so-called hybrid warfare and what we can conceive of as sort of natural and normal state interaction. And this, I think, espionage, for example, is a case in point where, where do you draw the line between what we would categorize as hybrid warfare and what we would categorize as normal intelligence activity? So I think it's the point being that it's quite important to be relatively precise and also confined, I think, when we formulate our deterrence strategies and concretely define what it is precisely that we're seeking to deter.
One of the things we can do and are doing at the moment is we can actually put the effort in and expose Russian adventurism, sub-threshold active measures. And, arrests can be made. Publicity. This is demonstrating that we're not entirely powerless. And I was pleased to see in Germany that the the Constitutional Protection Authority had actually just done that. And that's a very good signal to send. You can't expect to get away with a lot of this stuff.
But I think a big activity that maybe could bear fruit also is coalition building, because this is, I think, where we are maybe still a little bit weak. There are all sorts of countries out there, and it's not just the axis of evil that was defined this morning, but this is all of Africa, this is Latin America. They're kind of sitting on the fence. And I think as Western NATO countries, we could engage more in trying to bring them on board. And maybe it's not on the entire Russia-Ukraine issue, but issues like that, right? Space, because a lot of these countries, the BRIC countries, they actually, I think, have a big interest also in not having space war.
And just the point on the Arctic, one thing we can do to complicate, if not deter, is to add Sweden and Finland to the alliance, which makes Russian activities in the Arctic that much more difficult and much more transparent to us.
Okay. The gentleman with the microphone, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mateusz Milczarek. I'm a student at King's. My question is about the nuclear sharing program. What do you think about expanding this program and inviting, for instance, some state from eastern flank? Thank you.
So I think, and I've written on this, the notion that NATO wants to establish a new nuclear storage facility in Poland, I think, is completely off. I mean, we're not going to be putting new nuclear storage facilities in the eastern countries. What we need to do is to take qualified air crews, fly F-35s from the eastern countries that want to participate, and integrate them into existing NATO dual-capable aircraft squadrons with their wing flashes showing that the country is participating, but to create more of a broad NATO dual-capable aircraft deterrent. The notion of an independent Polish base, no. Bringing Polish pilots and maybe Finnish pilots and other pilots into existing squadrons would strengthen deterrence militarily and politically.
Marina, did you want to come in there? I mean, you mentioned earlier the German decision, and of course, after the invasion of Ukraine, Germany then went ahead to say we'll take F-35 to carry on the nuclear burden sharing and the nuclear role. Is that secure going forward? And what did you think of the question about possibly the eastern flank?
I mean, what is secure in Germany, right? I mean, I think this is a very important question to ask. Because I think, under the big elephant in the room that we don't really touch about and just, barely is the Trump presidency. Right? And of course, we can be optimistic and say the institutions in the United States and also the Pentagon and the elites, they're so strong that in the end they will do the right thing. But there is also a pessimistic view, and I look at you, but like everybody else who is kind of familiar with the American system, I've just spent a year at SAIS as a visiting professor, that there are forces in the United States that I don't want to trust the future of my country, and that doesn't mean, like that it will be that forever, but I think there could be a very bumpy road ahead. And so to the question of Poland, but also to the question of Germany, of course, like we all need to work on a plan B. It's just what we need to work on. I understand that the Poles think of a plan B. President Duda talks to Trump and maybe tries to get some kind of a bilateral agreement. Unfortunately, in the German case, this is actually some kind of agreement, whether this is overt or secretive, with Russia. It's just a reality, right? If the United States is no longer there to protect Germany and Europe, it's not France and it will not be Great Britain that will, like where the Germans really think that they can, put the fate of the country in their hands.
Rely on them, yes, to that degree. Yeah. Was there a hand up in the gods there that I missed before? No, because I realise I haven't taken a question yet from someone on the higher level, as it were.
I'll try to aspire to higher levels. Andy Corbett from King's College London and the UK Defence Academy. To what extent do the panel think that NATO has a strategy of doing deterrence, as opposed to a policy which relies on deterrence based on the fact that we have nuclear weapons, therefore we deter?
David?
I think that goes back to my sort of opening remarks, that for quite a lot of the Cold War, we sort of assumed things. And we can't assume them now. And my reading of NATO today is it is very active in trying to work out, both at the military level and the policy-making level, how do you deter President Putin from military adventures against NATO countries, thinking it through and not just taking some old doctrine and saying we're going to continue to believe in this. And that involves the conventional side as well as the nuclear side. I'm reasonably optimistic that the NATO staffs are capable of giving leaders the necessary options.
And NATO is, since say maybe 2018, doing a lot more to demonstrate its military capability. I mean, not only the forward deployments in the Baltic states, more exercises, more forces flowing from the United States, the dual capable aircraft forces doing many more exercises to show that they and other supporting aircraft from non-nuclear rolled allied countries can perform in a military role. And I think that's not unobserved by the Russians.
Sorry, there wasn't a hand I missed there. No, I mean, I'd like to just, in the last few minutes, sorry, were you about to jump in there, Kristin?
I could also jump in on this question of strategy versus a policy of deterrence. I would agree with Frank, obviously, that NATO has been doing a lot in the past couple of years and come a long way, I think, in its deterrence deliberation and in its formulation of deterrence policy or strategy. I think that there is still potentially work to be done in terms of deliberating how to calibrate a deterrence policy that's fit for purpose in terms of deterring an adversary like Russia, where there is potential for delineating, I think, the difference between deterrence policy and defense policy. As in many contexts, my impression is that in the NATO context, one often tends to sort of mention the two or conflate the two as two sides of the same coin, whereas they would not necessarily need to be. And I think that a conversation like that, for example, would be necessary in order to formulate a more comprehensive strategy, as you suggest, of deterrence.
Question here.
My name's Roger Hargreaves. I'm from the Cabinet Office. We listened to the Deputy Prime Minister talk about a sort of basket of risks and an expanding range of commitments that we'd have to make. and you sort of made the case for more effort and resource to be put into deterrence. If that's the case, which other risks do you think we should make less effort on to create that space, or should we be cutting other different government programs in other areas, or should we be taxing people more to pay for it?
I think actually the trick is not that all of a sudden all the NATO countries invest more in deterrence. Of course they need to invest more, but I think it's the coordination that matters. The signals need to be coordinated. And partially that happens, but partially I think that doesn't happen. And I think this is where actually, like, you know, when more work needs to be done in general, speaking with one voice very clearly. And here I think also, and I know, you know, the UK is maybe not the country that wants to hear this, I think there is also a NATO European voice that needs to be heard, not just a NATO US voice that needs to be heard.
David, then Kristin.
Roger, your heart would have been gladdened, as mine certainly was, by the last speaker's emphasis on resilience. But in a sense, we end up, don't we, with mini-max and maxi-min. We have to minimize the maximum harm that our adversaries can do, and that's why we're talking about deterrence and President Putin and armed attacks on NATO. But at the same time, look for ways in which we can maximize the minimum level of assurance that we can give the general public. And those two are not going to be the same. No nation, I think, can afford to cover all the risks equally. So there has to be some selection, and there are some kinds of consequences we really don't want to have to take in, you know, to recognize. So I think the more we can identify relatively lower cost ways in which we can improve, if you take the armed forces, improve their mobility, if you take civil population, increase the resilience of our national infrastructure, where we're not vulnerable to some sub-threshold bit of sabotage unclaimed by anybody, which suddenly turns the lights out. And that's not necessarily a huge amount of money to devote to doing some of those things. And that will make us feel much stronger when it comes to the big risks.
I think the other thing is for the United Kingdom to be part of an integrated NATO defense and deterrent capability. The Treaty of Westphalia did not require every nation to have an Army, a Navy, an Air Force, and Marines, right? And so there's a degree of specialization which will allow countries to operate together and which to meet the multifold threats that we all face. And there can be specialization through NATO headquarters, through SACEUR, that allows us to do affordably exactly what David's talking about.
Kristin, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to just share an observation from the Norwegian context in terms of prioritizations. I don't know the UK context as well as I know the Norwegian context, but evidently this is the same conversation taking place in all our countries, where I think sort of a fundamental premise of those conversations is this need for a public conversation relating to how there is now a significantly changed security and threat environment, which forces a greater emphasis on preparedness, on resilience, as compared to what we have experienced in the past 30 years. So we've come to a position now where we need to basically shift the way that we do our society, that we prioritize our budgetary and societal resources, and that demands basically a comprehensive shift also in the public and the political discussion regarding how we protect and defend the values and interests that are most important to us. So in the Norwegian context, at least, we've spent a lot of time on precisely starting that public conversation in order to build a better fundament to make prioritizations towards national defense, preparedness, and resilience in a quite different way than what we have done in the post-Cold War era.
I'm just going to do shameless chair's prerogative, just that we've just got a couple of minutes left, but we've really had a good and deep discussion around the issues regarding Putin, the threshold, the grey zone, the different ways that things could escalate laterally. But I just want to ask you to look a bit further out and a bit maybe less European in focus to the China question. I mean, we see these figures about China raising its nuclear stockpile in quite a short period of time to, I think, 1,500 warheads. Do you think, I guess this is firstly a question for you, Frank, but the others should feel free to come in on it. Do all the things we've been talking about in relation to Putin and trying to influence his decision-making simply copy across with China? Is it essentially the same doctrine, or are we, the West, having to learn completely new rules about how we engage strategically with that challenge?
This is what I meant, but the fundamentals haven't changed. I mean, you have to take the two leaders, and you have to say, what do they value? And in each case, because of the structure of their governments and the structure of the men, it's the leadership itself, it's the support structure that keeps them in place, it's selected elements of key elements of their military forces and their war supporting industry. And you have to visibly be capable of holding that at risk and to say, do not attack us or our allies, because as David said, when it's all over, you will not have created the greater China beyond Mao that you hope to do, or the greater recast Russia that gives you Tsar Vladimir the Great. You have to hold at risk what they value. New leaders, that may change, but and with a modest increase in U.S. strategic forces, we will be able to do that easily and simultaneously.
Kristin?
I think I will respectfully disagree with the notion that the challenge fundamentally looks the same. I think the challenge fundamentally looks relatively different, in part because nuclear weapons play a very different role in the military and national security strategies of Russia and China, respectively, notwithstanding this potential increase in the the Chinese nuclear arsenal. I think that warrants very careful studying and understanding of not only what these respective leaders value, but also the way in which these countries and their military bureaucracies think about and plan for a potential nuclear employment. And I think that their reading and understanding of us and our strategy is also potentially quite different. I think it's very important that we keep paying attention to these differences in order to formulate as effective a deterrence strategy as possible vis-a-vis them.
Thank you. Well, I think in a place like KCL, the message "more study needed" will be well received. Thank you all indeed very much. I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for a great session.